Okay, it looks like we are live. This is the first edition. Welcome back here, everyone, to hashtag the things. Charles J. Baserap here, a special live episode of hashtag the thing, as I try to use the day of service in remembrance of the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on MLK Day 2021. Just talk a bit about the challenges that we face as midweek approaches. The late civil rights icon and American hero continues to serve and should continue to serve as an inspiration to all Americans and to all those who wish for a better life for all people in peace and harmony, right? In my last video, right here on the site on YouTube, I touched upon the whataboutisms and false equivalencies, as well as the blatant hypocrisies in responses to the Capitol riots from all angles. People who said for 100 plus days, nothing at all, as celebrities and politicians alike actively encourage rioting, not just protesting, which was okay, but suddenly clutching the pearls after a few hours, that rings a bit hollow to me. And that's the same for the people who are proclaiming the rioters as American heroes and patriots, especially as they were slamming all of the summer protests and lumping them in with the rioters. The truth, not my truth or his truth or her truth, but the actual truth, is that there were peaceful and violent elements of events over the summer and a few weeks back. Further, it's the truth that the root causes were very different, all right? One being rooted in the reality of the need for equitable policing and police reform to combat systemic racism in America, the other being rooted in a conspiracy theory that the election was rigged, which is, admittedly, somewhat ironic that the people who spent 4 years crying, "Not my president, oh my goodness," and claiming it was rigged in 2016 are now saying that such a thing is impossible, and vice versa. Again, the hypocritical stances are just blatant. And it honestly continues to shock me that people don't see it. I mean, are they literally unable to, or do they simply not want to? It boggles the mind. It really does. I said in Crossroads, it's okay to acknowledge things like that. It doesn't mean that you're giving up your position or taking the other side entirely. For example, when a Muslim speaks out against radical Islam, they're acknowledging that a group is using their faith for ill, but they're not saying what other groups are saying, that all Muslims are bad. You can sit there and say, you know what, hey, I hate what the other side was doing, but my side was just doing literally the exact same thing. So maybe I should be consistent instead of stretching for the Olympic gold in mental gymnastics. Why so many people almost pathologically seem to feel they have to be all in or nothing with certain topics, I don't get. It's like they have to prove their bona fides. At that point, it almost becomes a little bit culty when you daren't speak out of the pre approved talking points, lest you're no longer good enough for the group. Eurasia is and always has been our wartime enemy. It's hard to say that Trump is completely innocent or guilty of incitement, and I outlined some arguments from a legal standpoint, not an emotional one, but a legal one, for and against that in the last video. But he certainly did little to quell the movement leading up to it by propagating false narratives before, during, and after the election. One of the biggest flaws in the he directly incited the riots on the day they happened, given based on the speech that he gave earlier in the day argument, is that the FBI and other investigators are showing that certain groups have prepared and planned in advance, and in fact came prepared to storm the Capitol if they had the shot to. So it's hard to say someone incited something on the day of when the plans were already set in place beforehand, days, weeks in advance. And that's going to be a huge factor in the impeachment 2 Electric Boogaloo saga when it comes time to determining the extent to which his words had an effect, especially as various members of Congress are reminding other members of Congress of their own words over the past 4 years and over the summer at various times, which could also certainly be seen as being insightful based on their current definition and criteria for that. Now, of course, as always, when one side says it, there's a Rolodex of excuses. When the other side does it, it's always wrong. It just depends on what side you're on. There's no room for nuance or balance any longer in a lot of ways. We didn't really mean we shouldn't sleep in the beds. We meant we shouldn't sleep in them with the sheets on, obviously. If you recall, there were protests when President Obama was elected, and there were some, not a lot, but there were some that turned violent. That was far more pronounced when Trump was elected. And we all saw the Starbucks and other stores destroyed and the fires and all of that on the day of the inauguration. And I also saw people condoning it by bringing up that there were protests during Obama, as if those two things, those two wrongs magically created a right somehow. And I expect, sadly, for it to possibly be even more so this time around, given the intelligence chatter. And if I were law enforcement, I'd be watching not just DC, but soft targets in other states too, where there's less ability to defend things. That's just counterterrorism 101. That was literally part of my job for years, assessing threats and trying to find a counter to them. So I'm a little concerned. I am. But pay close attention to how the media frames the narratives when or if things do happen, and do a compare and contrast of what's focused on and what isn't. It'll be an interesting experiment, especially considering how many articles I've seen about the danger Capitol Police were in and describing how dangerous it was for them. And oh my goodness, some cops were injured and beaten and stuff like that during the Capitol riots after months of glossing over how many cops that happened to over the summer, after glossing over how many Secret Service officers just on a single night in June at the White House were injured when people were climbing the fences erected to keep them out away from the main fence of the White House complex, trying to get in and attacking the police with bottles, batons, sticks, even knives. Those didn't just materialize out of thin air in response to something being done first, they were already set to go. I asked the question in the last video, what do you think they were planning on doing if they had gained access, if they had made it over that next fence? They're going to have a picnic? No, they were going to do what we saw at the Capitol. That they failed doesn't make them good guys, however noble the root cause may have been. Those actions, along with the almost nightly firebombing and vandalism and attacking of the Capitol buildings and stores and police stations, and harassment of people sitting, down to dinner because they were refusing to salute in kind or had American flags in the American Northwest, they weren't justified, and they were about destruction that was all but encouraged by DAs that refused to press charges and celebrities and politicians wanting blanket bail fundraisers, an issue I talked about in several videos already, most notably in episodes 1.1 and 1.3. You don't show up armed and then claim you were there for peace. And if I try to kill someone and fail, well, you know what? I can be charged with attempted murder. Sure, that's not as bad as actual murder, but that doesn't mean I'm the good guy. So think about that too, how the reactions are different, where if you're just boiling them down to a simple basic dichotomy of right left spectrum, they've taken up opposite stances of what they were 6 months ago. This has been compounded by the social media censorship in some ways, and that's a topic for a full video one day. But it astounds me that so many people I know that are on the left are okay with this, especially those who bash the NFL for their initial reactions of Colin Kaepernick kneeling and things like that. And for the record, as I stated right here on hashtag the thing, I supported the kneeling, even as I had some criticisms of its effectiveness, but I did support the act of kneeling. I had no problem with that. I didn't see it as anti-American at all. All right, so let's get that clear. But it's one thing to block a comment that's encouraging violence, but posting a photoshopped picture of Nicolas Cage stealing the Declaration of Independence from National Treasure into the Capitol riot scene, that getting a ban for encouraging violence, that's happened to some people I know. Another was logged out of his account for asking an online, openly public outdoor outfitter store, whose name I'm not going to name, I'm not going to throw them under the bus because it wasn't them who reported it, about ammunition for hunting. And that was shut down. It was an actual business's Facebook page and a question and answer thread about items in stock, nothing even remotely political or anything in any way. And it was claimed it was incitement of violence, and the account was locked. We claim there's no cancel culture, but funnily, it wasn't until the hive mob started going a little bit more after some of the more left-leaning celebrities that we've seen some pushback, because suddenly people like Marr and Silverman, etc., they're warning about it because the worms turned, and the monster they fed has started biting the hand that did so. And we saw how many conservative groups wanted Harry Potter and stuff like that banned, are now a little bit all of a sudden like, oh, why are they banning us for thinking it? Look, it's been happening all around. A buddy of mine, recently posted something, and someone responded that, hey, censorship and extremism are just not cool by me. I don't like it. I'm not a fan of the far right and the far left, but I'm really nervous about, where the line gets drawn. And somebody else had the audacity to say that not all conservatives were racist or evil, and they were attacked. The irony completely lost by the attackers. On Facebook, I repeated an experiment 3 times, all with the same results, most recently a couple of months ago. I reported posts that were blatantly racist or violent or whatever against minority groups or even politicians or celebrities. Then I copy and pasted them with an alt ID and posted them with white instead of black, or Christian instead of Jew, or Trump instead of Pelosi or Obama or whoever, then reported those from my original account. In the majority of cases, the originals were deemed in violation of Facebook's public, guidance, their standards of community, whatever it is, and the others weren't. So, in a post I've now deleted because I just don't want any association with it, it was not against community standards of Facebook to write that quote, "We shouldn't stop fighting until all the whites are dead at our feet." Or that quote, "If we just take out more cops, we wouldn't have to worry about police brutality," end quote. That last one with the same accompanying GIF, however you pronounce it, as the original post that said blacks instead of cops. That of a guy firing a gun. Now, others may have experienced the opposite, in which they've had completely different things. I can only go by the experiments I've personally conducted, but even appeals weren't heard. Meanwhile, I got a warning on my own account on Facebook for hate speech because I had a picture posted a decade ago saying "scissors beat paper" with a picture of Churchill flashing the peace sign juxtaposed to Hitler saluting. The obvious joke being that, the hands, rock, paper, scissors, while also being clearly anti Hitler. But context only seems to count sometimes. When celebrities that have threatened and peddled hate or have gone full on anti Semitic, like Nick Cannon or other people on the left, and there are those on the right who have done this for different reasons are also wrong. But we've had a lot of people on the left recently attacking Wonder Woman's Gal Gadot for being cast in Cleopatra, calling her a racist Zionist terrorist because she was she is Israeli and she wasn't the IDF, and that's been okay. Well, is that really okay? I see a lot of signs in my neighborhood that say love is love. Well, you know what? Hate is hate. None of this justifies racism or is an argument to give people a pass for being genuinely racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever, but it's asking for better consistency. And even the CEO of Twitter acknowledged that there are some dangerous precedents being set. And when fact checkers on Facebook and Twitter, for instance, can remain anonymous, unlike on some sites like PolitiFact, where there's often a byline, it shields them from any accountability. Part of that I get. Sadly, it's to prevent harassment. It's sad that people would get harassed for things, but it also prevents them from being asked why they deem X okay and not Y when they appear to be the same on the surface. Why was a post that had 4 quotes of alleged incitement of violence by 4 Democrats flagged as mostly false on the basis of context? Because 2 of the 4 made their comments before this past summer. Yet a post alleging Trump called all illegal immigrants animals wasn't similarly flagged on the same pretense, despite that the fact-checking websites like the aforementioned PolitiFact acknowledged that that comment in question was directly aimed at members of MS-13 and not all illegal or legal immigrants at all. Why was one flagged and one wasn't? Those things are happening, and if you're paying attention to different sites instead of comfort food sites that already pander to your ideologies, you'll see that. Go outside your comfort zone. So it's easy to see how people on the right can have what appears to be a paranoia, whether it's right or wrong, when there's seemingly, it's just from people's personal experiences may differ, but seemingly seeing a pattern of what's deemed hate and what's not, tending to be if it comes from one side, it's okay. If it comes from the other side, it's not. And how some sites like Parler have attracted not only conservatives who felt jilted, but also by some full-on nutters, some of which are very violent and dangerous. When you can have active pages on Facebook that advocate for bounties and doxing of cops, the latter of which Sean King did on Twitter when he also incited violence by being proud of how stores were boarded up in advance of the Breonna Taylor verdicts and how it was good to make them afraid. Here's some advice. When people need to be afraid that they'll be killed or lose their businesses because you don't like a verdict, and some people provably, not conjecturally, provably, had U-Haul trucks rented out with bats, sticks, and shields in advance of the verdict, you may want to check what side of history is in fact the right one you're always talking about. Now, I've seen some people say that if a Nazi agrees with something, then the cause is automatically invalid, and they know they're on the right side of history if they can look around and see no Nazis. And I can see that to an extent if I saw things purely myopically and ignored that hate groups like Nation of Islam supported President Obama. That didn't mean that President Obama supported them or condoned the actions or hate speech that they speak. Or how many openly socialist and communist groups supported and support the left more and more the past few years, after seeing how many millions were killed and destroyed by such groups throughout history. And quoting Anne Applebaum here in her book The Iron Curtain, quote, certain patterns were followed almost everywhere. First, the elimination of right-wing or anti-communist parties, then the destruction of the nonconformist left, then the elimination of opposition within the Communist Party itself. End quote. It's a bit of history from post World War II Europe we're seeing in some groups now, especially when you have elected officials talking about making lists and re education and the like. No, thank you. I have seen that movie. Anyone remember what happened after Stalin's folks helped save Eastern Europe after the Nazis were defeated? Maybe pick up a book and read about it. There's a reason that a lot of Cubans in Florida, despite the overall Hispanic sentiment against President Trump, voted for him. It wasn't an endorsement of him as much as it was a repudiation of the fear of a governmental system they fled in the first place, taking root, however realistic or not it may be, here in America. It's like I said 100 times about the Palestinians. A vote for Hamas was not necessarily a vote for terrorism or being anti Israel. It was because Hamas was providing basic services and jobs and things like that that the corrupt PLO was not. Of course, that's not to say everyone on the left falls into any of the things I've mentioned by far, or supports socialism, etc., or that Biden's agenda is that at all. The Democratic caucus call after the election was frantic. One person even all but demanding they never say the words like socialism again because it almost cost an election that was supposed to be a slam dunk, because they feared what I've been saying for years, that the moderates were pulling back and the left extremes were costing them and helping fuel the right extremes. Unfortunately, that's correct, exactly as I predicted. And it's more tragic that there aren't enough on the right in politics willing to admit that either, like the soon to be former President Trump, whose willful blindness or refusal to acknowledge it is undoubtedly a part of the rise of these newer groups that we're seeing. You can't sound the alarm on socialism and things like that, of that nature, if you're going to sit around and say nothing about how many white supremacists and nationalists have been showing up and supporting the party. See something, say something, and say it loudly. Say no. Waters can sometimes get muddied when we see chapters of Black Lives Matters and Proud Boys gathering together in a peace vigil together in some towns, then calling for or engaging in violence in others. Who's the real one? I addressed the problem of a lack of centralization in some of these groups in my opening video mini-series on hashtag the thing, the racism in America, episodes 1.1 through 1.5, highlighting how this identity crisis allows people to pick and choose which is really okay by pointing to the more palatable and saying, hey, those are the right ones, and pointing to the extreme ones and going, no, they're not really what we're about. It's something that affects all groups too, even those organized. I've talked already about Islam struggling to get out of the shadow of those like Al Qaeda and ISIS that have corrupted their religion, or even those in of Christian denominations. There's some that openly bash homosexuals. You have preachers who preach against that, and you have that doesn't represent all Christians. The point here, and I've gone over it at length both in print and in video, is that extremes exist, and we need to tamp them down, even when it may not be convenient to do so because we believe the root causes, whether just ones or not. Because if you're going to tell someone silence is compliance, then say nothing because you don't want to ruffle feathers, well, guess what that makes you? Stand up, speak out. And remember, I'm someone who did that and lost my job, my reputation, all of that. So I know that it's a hard ask. I'm not saying it's easy, but sometimes you got to do it. I've said it before that this is a pivotal moment in time for the country, and we need to all be aboard stopping the hate, not just when it's convenient to do it or when we think it's on our side and won't come for us, because we might as well dig two graves, as the saying goes, the more that tribalism becomes entrenched. The inauguration does scare me, and it's sad to say. I've worked one before. I was out there when I was in the Secret Service on Capitol Hill at the checkpoints and then wading through the crowds during W's second inauguration. And it was even scarier for me because I was a few weeks from graduation from the academy at that point, so I wasn't legally allowed to carry my firearm. I had the uniform, but I had no apparatus because I wasn't allowed to at that point, which essentially meant I was a body. I was a speed bump with hand-to-hand training, and that's it. But they needed the personnel. They pulled us out of training for it. So I know firsthand from being down there how crazy they can be. And it's even crazier now, all these years later. That was back in '05. I wish President and Vice President Biden and Harris luck. I really do. I hope that they can see the schisms all around in their own party and in the country as much as they do with the other party. And I want them to succeed because I don't want to see us fail. I don't want to see America fail. Even if I don't agree with every action put forth, I do not want to see this ship go down because I'm on it. But the only way to move forward is to have accountability and a layoff of the continuously divisive rhetoric of making lists like some deranged Stalinist Santa Claus and by both parties acknowledging the dangers of the extremes in their own corners they erroneously think they can control. Quoting Anne Applebaum again, quote, "Before a nation can be rebuilt, its citizens need to understand how it was destroyed in the first place, how its institutions were undermined, how its language was twisted, and how its people were manipulated. They need to hear individual stories, not generalizations about the masses. They need a better grasp of what motivated their predecessors to see them as real people and not as black and white caricatures." End quote. Have I not been saying that for years? I know so many people who voted for Trump who dislike a lot of what he's done, but they've become afraid to even admit they voted for him because of that hive mob, and the accusations. I thought we learned from McCarthyism and the Islamophobia that followed 9/11, but here we are. Not everyone who voted for Trump or AOC or Pelosi or whoever necessarily agrees with them fully. Some do, some are all in. A great many don't, whether you agree with them or not. Even those who were there at the Capitol weeks ago weren't all evil people, despite the actions of others present, just like the overwhelming majority of demonstrations over the summer were conducted in peace despite others acting contrary in their names. Now, I've defended Trump from unfairness, like the aforementioned animal quote, or those wishing death upon him, those non insightful love Trump's hate folks when he had COVID. And I've defended, politicians like, AOC, because I think that while she's completely off base on a great many things, and that someone who openly stated that facts weren't as important as they actually should be, is probably one of the last who should be speaking about what types of things the media should be reporting on. I do think she means well, and I do think that she loves this country. I don't think she hates America, and I don't like seeing things like her being like portrayed as a horse or made fun of or dehumanized and things like that. That's wrong. That's not acceptable to me. Not every Republican or Democrat is X or Y. There are some groups to which that applies, like, with absolutism, every racist is a racist. Every person who commits terrorism is a terrorist. But applying that to parties across the board, even if one thing is more prevalent in one than another, you can't do that because there's still people are individuals. And the second you paint them all like that, it ruins it. You can't do it. You can't engage people like that. And that's something that the left in general, not every person on the left, but the left in general has not gotten through their heads in the last 4 years. And creating lists is only making that worse. So now, to those seeking to do harm and disrupt the peaceful transition of power on Wednesday, those who are planning violence, let's get something straight. I've said it before, you're not heroes, you're not patriots. My advice is not to follow through. And if you're upset, try another way to convey it because you won't win, you won't change minds, and I guarantee you will not be the heroes of the story. You will be terrorists. And anyone watching this who supports that sort of violence, the door's that way. You're not welcome here. I don't care if you've been a friend for years or you're my own blood. I want nothing to do with you. A difference of opinion on policy or sports or foods or whatever, that's one thing. That's fine. That's all just part of life. But openly supporting violent insurrection and terrorist acts, that's a hard pass. You're not welcome in my life. I deserve better, and so does America, and so do all of those on the side of peace and democracy. You don't have to like it, but there's ways of not liking things, and that's not one of them. That's not the answer. To everyone, right and left, and those moderates who I know are out there, they're often afraid to say anything in the walk on eggshells mercurial minefield of the 21st century where you never know what's offensive day to day. It's just a whim of whatever hashtag is popular. I wish you health, wellness, and safety. We'll get through this. I know we will. We have to. This has been Charles J. Baserap with a special live episode of Hashtag the Thing. Be well, America. Good night and good luck.